Bray Literary Festival. Our event today is Brave New Words, and it features 3 new writers who have recently published fiction books. They are Pat O'Connor, Alice Lyons, and Marianne Lee. We're going to hear a short reading from each of our featured readers today, first of all, from their latest work. And when they've made the readings, then we'll have a chat about some of the experiences they've had in producing their first books, and also about their methods and approaches to writing in general. So our first reader today will be Alice Lyons. Alice Lyons is a recipient of the Patrick Kavanagh Award for Poetry and the inaugural Ireland Share of Poetry Bursary awarded by Nuala and Dhomhnaill in 2004. Her co-directed poetry film, The Polish Language, was nominated for an IFTA in 2010. Her novel, Oona, was published by Lilliput in April this year. From the USA, she has lived for over 20 years in the west of Ireland, and she lectures in writing and literature at the Yeats Academy of Art, Design, Architecture at the IT in Sligo. So Alice, maybe you'd give us a short reading, please.
Okay, thanks, Brian. So my book's called and just a brief introduction to it. The protagonist, Oona, is born into an immigrant community, first generation immigrant community right outside of New York City in the East Coast of the US. And she is surrounded by a community that is very focused on gaining security, losing their ethnic identities, and getting monetary value or monetary, getting a lot of money quickly. The book tracks Oona's life as she tries to deal with an early loss, a grief of her mother, losing her mother when she is young, a young teenager. And she's trying to find what's real, because her feeling is that she was born into a community where being real and the real things in life, including death, aren't people don't know how to deal with it. So in her journey, she discovers that she's an artist, and the book tries to center art making, and it makes an equivalence between making art, visual art, and writing. There is no difference. There wasn't any difference in my mind in writing the book, that writing and art making are the same thing. So Oona, is an artist and a writer, and I, as the writer of this book, tried to center art making as a way of talking about the importance of writing and art in the development of a person, and in Oona's case, in really as the way that she kind of puts herself back together after being really dissolved in a certain sense by grief. So I'm going to read just 2 short pages of a chapter that takes place in the suburban New Jersey community where she grows up. But the chapter I tried to write it as if I was drawing it with charcoal, vine charcoal, which is, just, the stuff that people do figure drawing with, those real thin sticks of charcoal. So I'll read these 2 pages. Imagine a river jammed with slim burnt timbers after a fire has raged upstream. A charred sapling glade has fallen in the water, making baggy black rafts that flex as the river curves and water advances. The burnt sapling surfaces are matte. They repel river water and have a mute shimmer. This is the picture given when peering at charred vine sticks en masse in an artist's drawer. Squeaky, gently curving sticks in a bag filmy with charred dust sitting in the easel's ledge. Lightweight because they're merely blackened vine ash, barely keeping straight. They chime when their bag is gently shaken, a delicate tinkle as fired fine white clay fragments will emit when jiggled. Charred vine is a drawing material usual in life drawing because with the hand's butt it can be erased, the fingers and the entire hand drawing in tandem and blackening. Charred vine lines are easily amended and reasserted, and a gray mist is general in a paper where charred vine has been used, a mid-gray tint. There is a give in charred vine. It nearly melts in the paper as fingers press it. It is a perfect medium if what is wanted is a feeling that the fingers are actually making the drawing, are actually meeting the subject themselves. Charred vine fits in that tight space between finger and paper with little intermediary muss. It captures gesture beautifully. Detail is difficult, as charred vine speaks in generalities. It creates 3, perhaps 5 gray tints, and it never makes the deepest black, say the kind that black pastel can achieve. It isn't in charred vine's nature, as it is in itself dark gray. Dark gray can't make black. If charred vine were layered and layered and rubbed, it'd achieve a dark, dark gray, but never black, never pure black. Take a charred vine stick and make an attempt at drawing the suburb, its vaguenesses and sadnesses. There is the retail center, the Italian delicatessen, pharmacy, supermarket, the pitiful bank. There is the tarmac, the cul-de-sac. Find the vulgar architectural angles in the pricey real estate where families abide, the laundry chutes and central vacuum systems, massive juicers and ice makers, but find as well the inwardness in grasses, the hideaways in culverts, in maple glades, fragrant autumn leaf piles, in the tennis club's equipment hut, the shade it casts. Press hard and make the blackest blacks that can be made in the charred vine shade range. Find the gray tints as well, the kindnesses and tendernesses that were there, that want and deserve being drawn, that perhaps haven't been drawn well, hidden as they might be by a spurned resident's bitterness. Use the fleshy thumb base, smear the burnt vine and make middle grays. Make sure the lake's filmy mists are captured, the way they might snag a dad's heart. Take him elsewhere than where he is at present, in his Mercedes, hurrying up Lakeview Drive, the early Wall Street train his target. A needed eraser can lift the gray values lighter if needed, perhaps where the sun hits the man-made beach, where it glints in the lifeguard chair's white painted timbers, in the sun flecks reflecting, in a tennis-playing lady's Ray-Bans.
Thanks very much, Alice. That was really beautiful, and I think it gave us a good flavour of certainly the opening of the novel, the early part of the novel, those images of kind of suburban America, which may be new to some of us, but really bring it home. And the colours and the gradations colours in it are really important, I think, in the book. It came across really well. So thanks very much for that. Our second reader will be Marianne Lee. Marianne Lee grew up in Tullamore, Offaly, and lives in Dublin with her husband. She has a degree in visual communications from the National College of Art and Design and an MPhil in creative writing from Trinity College, Dublin. Marianne works as a designer and copywriter and has published a selection of poetry and self-recorded an album of music. A Quiet Tide is her first novel published by New Island. So Marianne, if you give us a short reading, that'd be great.
So my novel is Quiet Tide, and it's a reimagining of the life of a very early Irish botanist, and really the first female Irish botanist, Ellen Hutchins, who was born in 1785 in Ballylickey in County Cork. And in her early life, Ellen was sent to school in Dublin, probably, you know, to learn how to become a young lady, as befitted her class. So she was from the landlord class and the landed gentry, I suppose, but probably the poorer end of the landed gentry. They weren't a very wealthy family. They were sort of on the wane, the Hutchins family at the time, from being probably wealthy at one time. And Ellen is sent to Dublin and becomes quite ill during her school days and leaves school, and is sent to live with a family friend, the Stokes family. So Dr. Whitley Stokes was a very well-known physician and a well-known botanist. And he lived in Harcourt Street with his wife. In the novel, she's called Louise. She was called something else in real life, but I had to change her name to Louise because she was, in real life, I think that she was called Marian or Marianne, and there was so many Marians and Mariannes at the time. I had to change some of the names. So Dr. Stokes lives with his wife, Louise, and many children. So Ellen comes into the household, and I was very interested in the dynamic of a young woman coming into an already established house and what that would do to the family dynamic and how the individuals in the family would react to that. So in this piece, it's one of Ellen's early mornings waking up in the Stokes family. And one of the reasons why she has become so ill is that it's quite obvious she hasn't been eating properly. And this was quite a common thing for young women sent to boarding school at this time. So the Brontes would talk quite a lot in their writings about it, something they would have been very familiar with when they were sent to school, for example. So young girls not getting enough food, basically. It wasn't through any sort of pickiness or anything like that, but they just weren't fed properly and they became very weak and ill. So Ellen is quite ill. She is living with the Stokes family, and as I said, this is one of her first early mornings waking up. So I should say Louise, Dr. Stokes' wife, and Dr. Stokes have just had a conversation where they're discussing Ellen's health and what they can do to boost Ellen's health. They're quite concerned about it. And Dr. Stokes has suggested that rather than trying to force her to eat and force her to come to dinner, that they would leave little treats and little snacks in her room for her to find herself and see if she can find her way back. And so this becomes sort of the introduction of a sort of sensory experience for Ellen, and we begin to see how she is a young person of very interesting reactions to things. How she reacts to things is quite unusual, and that she is, you know, we can see the beginnings of a sort of exceptional person emerging. The rumple of curtains being drawn, a soft voice. Will I open the shutters too, miss? Ellen murmured, yes. Clanging wood and metal, a flood of harsh light. She put her arm across her eyes. There's fresh water in the bowl, the servant said. I'll come back in a minute. The door closed. Ellen got up and pulled the chamber pot from under the bed, squatted over it to pass water. Afterwards, she washed her hands. The water was warm and the soap had a faint floral smell. Not roses, less sweet, woodier. She unbuttoned her nightdress, pulled on her drawers, fastened her stays under her breastbone. There was a small bowl on the table that had not been there before. The servant must have brought it. She padded across the room, the floorboards cool and pleasantly rough against the soles of her feet. She lifted the bowl to her face. Cream and a handful of red berries. She looked at the door. Her stomach grumbled. She dipped her finger in the cream, sucked, tasted sugar. Her tongue curled and saliva flooded her mouth. She used the berries to scoop up the cream, the pips cracking against her molars. When she'd finished, she wiped her mouth and hands. Then she took down her Sunday dress, her least shabby. She'd half pulled it on, folds of material pooling around her legs, when the servant knocked again. It was the young, pock-faced girl, drab and tidy in a brown dress and cap. Let me, miss. At school, they had helped each other dress, turning to offer their backs, raising their arms as if in a well-rehearsed dance. The servant's fingers tugged at the buttons, a pleasing sensation. The tall trees I see from the drawing room window, Ellen said, are they part of a park? That's Clonmel lawns, miss, that belong to the Earl. Can I walk there? Well, no, miss, the gardens are for the Earl's private use. There's an underground passage from his house. I see. There's a garden at the back here, miss. She'd seen it from her window, cramped, covered in shadow most of the day. St. Stephen's Green down the road, the girl went on, her breath on Ellen's neck. And the master often goes on trips to the country from dawn till last light. Sometimes he brings Mrs. Stokes and the children with him for an afternoon. Collecting plants, he is. What for? The fingers paused. I don't know exactly, miss. He keeps them, I think, in a great book. Very interested in plants is the master. Now the fingers continued down to the base of Ellen's spine. There, that's done. Will there be anything else, miss? No, thank you. Janie, isn't it? Yes, miss. She showed a glimpse of jagged teeth and lifted the bowl from the table with a questioning look. I've finished, Ellen said. Wherever did they get those berries? Raspberries, they're called, miss. Fresh from Lord Clonmel's garden, especially for you. She reddened, bobbed, and fled. The next morning she left a dish of custard, dusted with a heady, rust-coloured powder she said was called cinnamon. Later in the day, coming back to the room to rest, Ellen found 2 potato cakes on the table, still warm, wrapped in a napkin, and a thimble-sized glass of sweet wine. She ate the cakes with her fingers, licking the warm fat. Butter? That trickled down her wrist. They had been given lard in school. Somewhere within her, the taste of the butter resonated, like the ringing of a distant bell. She ventured later into the drawing room, sat by the window watching the passers-by on the pavement opposite. Louise came in. Ah, you've joined us. She seemed surprised, but pleased. Ellen stood up. I wanted to thank you, ma'am, for the delicacies you had brought to my room. Dr. Stokes thought it best. I must say we racked our brains to think of something suitable. They were delicious. You're very kind. She lowered her eyes, away from Louise's razor-sharp glance, endeavoured to keep her voice humble and grateful. Well, no doubt you're an obedient young woman. Do as the doctor tells you, and you'll soon have roses instead of ashes in your cheeks.
Thanks very much, Marianne. That's really good. It gives us a nice flavour again of the beginnings of the novel, which I think is great, and the beginning of kind of that little bit of tension between Louise and Ellen, which I think is, and that develops. They're just 2 different women.
Yeah.
Very much, Louise is very much of her time, I suppose, and Ellen is this sort of unique almost person, you know, of her time as well. So thanks very much for that. We'll move on then to our 3rd reader this morning, and that's Pat O'Connor. And Pat won the Sean O'Faolain International Short Story Prize, the Glimmertrain Best Start Short Story Prize, and was shortlisted for the Francis McManus, Fish, Hennessy, and the Sean O'Faolain Awards. His stories are published widely and have been broadcast on RTE. His radio play, This Time It's Different, was broadcast on 95 FM in 2014. His short story collection, People in My Brain, was published by Limerick Writers Centre last year. So Pat, maybe you'd give us a flavour of what the stories in People in My Brain are.
Hey, thanks very much. Well, here's my little volume. I don't really need to introduce too much because it's you know, what you meet at the beginning of a short story is all you get of introduction anyway. And I'm going to read from the beginning of one. Usually I'd read, you know, some of my stories are funny, and often you'd read those at festivals, but this is a totally different dynamic. And so I thought I'd read a slightly more serious story. And unusually for me, this is set in, it's set really during the economic crisis a little while back, but it's become relevant again. And so I set myself a task here to try and make the reader feel sympathy for a solicitor in the middle of an economic crisis. So I'm just going to launch into it. It's called Tulips. Sharon groaned at her reflection in the mirror. Another overcast morning, early June, and in the grey light, her eye sockets appeared even deeper than they already were. Ray, her husband, had glued this mirror to the bare concrete blocks. It was slightly crooked and a little too high, but better than nothing. This corner of their bedroom was to have been the ensuite, but it had not been plastered or wired, nor the partition built, and only the toilet and hand basin had been installed. Sharon put her fingertips to her cheekbone, angled her face to see the lines gathering around her eyes. A little makeup would help, but she didn't have anything left that contained a tint. Anyway, she had to go downstairs and look after the girls, get them fed and dressed so that her mother, Granny Trish, could collect them later on, and she and Ray could go to their Saturday jobs. Sharon lifted her handbag, plodded out through the door gap in the wall and down the uncovered wooden stairs. The smell of concrete was always worst in the mornings. She put her hand over her mouth, gulping softly. For more than a year, she'd had vague indigestion, but for the past couple of months, a pain in her stomach had woken her almost every night. Last night, she'd hardly slept at all. Lying there waiting for dawn, she had come to the formless realization that she could no longer carry on. She had to see a doctor. It was the very last thing they needed. So she told Ray when he got up that morning that she was going to a hairdresser before she went to the call centre. Why did she say such a crazy thing? They'd been cutting each other's hair for the last 2 years. They each worked 2, sometimes 3 jobs, because the practice where she worked as a solicitor could now only offer 3 days a week, and this combined with Ray's teacher salary could not pay the mortgage and the loan. They needed every single cent they could get. Ray drove a taxi 3 nights and at weekends, and she worked 3 nights as a bartender. On Saturdays, she worked in a call centre in Dhomhnaill, 70 minutes drive away. But what did Ray say? Great, he said. I'm glad you're doing something for yourself. How could he believe she'd spend money on herself? She stopped on the stairs, wiping her cheeks, sniffing back tears. Nausea welled in her stomach. She rummaged in her handbag for antacid tablets. In the bare, echoey hall, the crinkling of foil and plastic sounded incredibly loud. She hunched over the packet in case the kids might hear, popped 2 tablets, took a deep breath, and clipped briskly toward the kitchen. The sight of it made her droop. Boxes for cupboards, crappy cooker, crappy fridge, bare joists for a ceiling, a 40-bottle sommelier cabinet, never plugged in but unsellable, that they used as a worktop. Kira and Aoife sat dawdling at their porridge. Come on, Sharon called. Hurry up, let's go. Daddy's going to be working here today. But can we help, Mommy, can we? Kira with those big dark eyes. Not this time, Kira. He's going to be making cuts in the walls and it'll be really dirty and dusty. You've the little Aoife squeaked. But Mummy, can we watch the telly so, can we? We've got a Minecraft game that... No, but you can take it to Granny Trish's later. Please, Mummy. Sharon had to lean on the table, clench her teeth. Look, can't you just play outside till Granny comes? The whole place will be covered in dust, I told you. She heard Ray opening the back door, stamping the mud from his boots. He spent half an hour every morning at the vegetable patch, so that if every credit card failed and every check bounced, they would at least have something to eat each day. It gave them the illusion of security. That and the apple trees his Uncle Eamon had given them when they bought the site. Long-term business, Uncle Eamon said, winking, like houses and marriage. 8 trees with huge roots wrapped in sacks. They had planted them one November afternoon 3 years ago, their first involvement with the site. Ray did the heavy digging, Sharon and the girls arguing about which tree should go where, like it was the most important job in the world. Whenever Sharon looked at those trees, she remembered Ray's silhouette in the slanting sun, the girls with their toy spades and watering cans bossing each other and patting the soil. Her private vision of living in the country had been of tulips, masses and masses of tulips. It was something she'd carried since childhood, from a film perhaps, or a photograph. Ray had planted 200 bulbs for her between the driveway and the hedgerow, and now each springtime those tulips made a glorious blaze of yellow and pink and red, even though they were shaded by bushes and trees. At the time, she had pleaded with Ray to cut their hedgerow down, but even back then, there had been more important things to do. Now, time for gardening was out of the question. Still, last Sunday, when she had burst into tears after dropping an egg on the floor, and he said that's okay, not to worry, she told him he didn't understand one fucking thing about her. He hadn't even cut the hedgerow down. Normally, he was such a steady guy, but that day, he stamped off into the rain, borrowed a dreadful-looking chainsaw, and spent the whole afternoon cutting that hedgerow until it was time for his taxi shift. Now, Sharon watched him tow off his muddy Wellingtons, plod along the passage toward the kitchen. How thin his face had become, she hadn't noticed before. What would happen to them if he got sick? She turned quickly away, hurrying the girls, trying to keep calm. It was 3:30 a.m. when he got home from his taxi shift last night. And today was Saturday, probably it'd be 4, maybe 5. Do you need more breakfast? She asked shakily. He puffed his cheeks. No, better get started. Leave it at that. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Pat. That was really good, and it's an interesting choice of story as well, as you say, because a lot of your stories, I suppose, they're very effusive and they can be very funny and witty, and they can draw on lots of other ideas and concepts as well. So that's a very kind of focused kind of story, and it's really emotionally kind of challenging as well. So it's a really
difficult story to read. That's why
it is. I'd say it is. Yeah, I'd say it is difficult to read, but it's lovely to hear it as well. We'll chat more in detail about the 3 books in a while, but first of all, I think maybe we might sort of have a chat about the practicalities of the industry, for want of a better word, or what's your experience of getting that book out. So Alice, maybe you might tell me about how kind of where Oona started from and how you got it to the stage this year when the book was published by Lilliput. Just briefly, what your impressions are.
Yeah, quickly. I've published 3 books of poetry before this, and so this is my first prose work. I didn't really know how to approach publishers. I live in Sligo. I'm from the States, but I've lived in Ireland for 20 years. And so networks and that kind of thing aren't something that I'm very strong on. And I heard about the novel fair that the Irish Writers Centre runs. And I thought, well, let me do that. So when it was also really great to have a deadline to finish the book, because I worked on it for 4 years, but the end, trying to tie it up, was quite difficult. So I made a deadline of September 2 years ago, just this month, to finish it and get it into the novel fair. And then the novel fair is just a fantastic kind of speed dating experience with agents and publishers. And Anthony Farrell was the first publisher I talked to, and he is the publisher of Lilliput Press. And I sent him the book that day, and the next day he came back and said, please, would you hold this for us? We'd love to publish it. So it was really lovely to have it was easy once the novel fair happened. But the novel fair was wonderful also because I got to meet other people who had books. So Marianne right here beside me was someone I met there. And that was a really wonderful experience too. So I can't recommend it highly enough, what the Irish Writers Centre does for novelists, especially for.
That makes perfect sense as well, Alice, because as you say, the biggest problem as a writer, especially writing a long form thing like a novel, is you're writing it, you're working at it day on day or week on week, and you don't have anyone saying, you don't have an agent say at this stage, and they're not saying to you, oh, I need that book by next month or November or whatever. So having a deadline like the entry period for the novel fair, I think in itself is a great thing. It helps you to focus which is what's needed when you're working on a novel, I'm sure. So Marianne, you're obviously involved in the novel fair as well, so that's obviously played a big part in you coming to publication this year as well.
Yeah, I had heard about the novel fair, you know, years ago, and it had been on my radar, and then I sort of parked it. And when I started the book, I hadn't thought of novel fair. And when I started the book, you know, I'd been writing short stories. I had written songs for a period. I had done the MPhil. And I was trying to sort of find out, you know, can I do this? And the idea of writing a novel was just so intimidating to me. I just couldn't understand how people did it. How could you do such a thing? How could you write something so long? How could you see it through to the end? How could you sustain the idea? And it was deciding on the period. You know, I was very interested in that period of Irish history, and I looked around, I did some research, and it was through the house, it was through Harcourt Street that I found the story of Ellen Hutchins and the Stokeses and so on. So I started the novel, made good progress with it, and then, very similar to Alice, realised that the novel fair deadline would coincide maybe with me approaching the end of a first draft. So I worked my way through the first draft, and then I went back and focused very heavily on the first chapter, which is what you need to do for novel fair. And I just honed that. And actually, interestingly, I sent the first 3 chapters to a friend of mine who I trust very much and who I knew would like this sort of book. And she came back and said, oh, I really like it. Yeah, you're on the right track, but you need to ditch the first chapter. So, and you know, so it was my first experience writing a novel. That's a very hard thing to do, you know, to ditch 4,000 or 5,000 words when, you know, you're not used to writing huge amounts of prose. But I took her advice. I saw that she was right. I ditched the first chapter. I focused very heavily on my new first chapter, and refined it, polished it, had it as perfect as I possibly could have it, sent it off. So, I mean, again, like Alice, the novel fair experience was fantastic. It was my first time being in the room with other writers, other prose writers. That in itself was fantastic. And even if all that had happened was the novel fair experience, that would have been a huge step forward for me. And then Aoife Walsh of New Ireland, so I sent out, I was, you know, asked to send out the copy around, and it was Aoife Walsh in the end from New Ireland who I decided to go with. And I knew on the day that, I mean, everybody was so lovely. I mean, that was the other really the big revelation. You know, you have this idea and impression of what people in any profession are like, and you think with publishing, you know, you're just not sure. But everybody was so nice, so kind, so interested, so generous. But I knew that Aoife got it on the day. I could just see it in her eyes, and she went on to be just massively supportive. I worked with fantastic editor Susan Keever, and yeah, I mean, it was, you know, in a way, I feel like I'm very new to all of this still. I wouldn't say I was writing prose for years, even though I always wanted to be a writer and knew that I would be a writer of some kind. Yeah, this has all been very quick, very new. And I suppose being a new writer in the whole COVID era is another phenomenon in itself. So.
No, that again, it does make perfect sense, and you can see how the novel fair really is, you know, can be a great focus for people who are working on a project and maybe who are unsure about, you know, how to proceed. I suppose it makes you make decisions. You know, you made the decision to send it to a friend, and you made the decision to take that advice that you got. So you kind of, I think, you know, creating anything a lot of it is decision making at some level, as well as doing the writing and that. But so they were big decisions you took. But the novel fair is that great kind of resource that's in the background there. So it's worked really well for both you guys. So moving on to you, Pat, what's your experience like I know, like, I remember hearing you read one of your stories, Sex for the
A few years ago.
I daren't say how many years ago that was in the Writers Centre, but now it appears in People in My Brain, which was published last year by Limerick Writers Centre. So tell us about how you got to where you are. Well,
yeah, it's a slightly different story. Never had any success in the novel fair. Basically, I've been writing stories for quite a while. I've never managed to get one of the bigger publishers to to take an interest in the a short story collection. I have quite a few, and I'd more or less given up at that, and I'd started writing longer fiction, although still with short stories. When the short story comes along, you just have to go, like it's like a surfer on a wave. You forget everything else and off you go. But what happened, what got me putting a collection together most recently was just being approached by the guys in the Penny Dreadful down in Cork after, I think one of them, they'd been involved with the Munster Literary Centre, and do a great job there on the Short Story Festival. And they said, well, would you fancy putting a collection together? And I said, no problem, I'll have it tomorrow. Unfortunately, then they had some money problems, which most publishers, I gather, have, particularly ones who publish short stories. And so it didn't happen that year. And the next year, it depended on Arts Council funding, and they didn't get the Arts Council funding. So I was gone again. And then, I published a couple of stories in Australia with a publisher down there, and they said, well, have you got a collection? I said, I certainly have. And, basically, I'd be putting together a collection. So we went through all of that and went right to the end. And then it just turned out that that publication just wasn't going to work. It would never be in the bookshops in Ireland, really. And so we parted company. But in the middle of that, we'd more or less gone right through to editorial and past that to book design. And in looking for quotes from other writers, I'd written into the guys here right in Limerick and said, any chance of any writers that might have read these and would give me a blurb? And they said, sure. He said, but why didn't you ask us to publish it? And I said, well, we might do that because right at that point, let's say the logistics of the Australian one were becoming apparent. And so on the fourth attempt, really, this was all slightly different collections, slightly different, stories in. And then suddenly it all happened very quickly. So, that was all happening in summer last year, and then it was published by November. So that's how that came along. Call a rocky road.
Yeah, it's a different route, certainly, Pat. Anyway,
totally different route.
Yeah, but I do think, just from my own experience, like short stories are a different animal, and they're, obviously in terms of writing, but also in terms of trying to sell them as well.
Yeah.
There is a great market, I think, for publishing individual short stories. There's great journals and there's great competitions out there. You've won a good few of them, Pat, and been involved in a good few of them. But as regards trying to place a collection with a publisher, most of them or even to find an agent, they want to know where your novel is. That's usually the first.
Well, it's simply that people just don't buy collections of short stories as much as they buy novels. It's a pretty simple fact.
Yeah, and I know you read in the papers every now and every few years, the resurgence of the short story, but it's really only a resurgence for a happy few. It's not a resurgence generally, in terms of the form. But in terms of your ability to stick at it, you did really well, I think. And I think Limerick Writers Centre, did a great thing by picking up these stories and putting them out there. Because I know
right under my nose all the time,
I know a lot of short story writers who read your work over the years, and it would have been surprised that there wasn't a collection from you earlier. And probably that's probably equally true of you guys as well, particularly you, Alice. I know your poetry and your visual artwork, people would have known you for that for years. So it's really interesting. I think when the book comes out, people are saying, why haven't we seen this before now? And I'm sure people are saying that in your case as well. So maybe just looking at the individual, the approaches to your work. When as I was reading each of your books, I was very much struck by two things that kind of kept coming to me all the time as I read them was the influence of art, certainly, in all of the works, but also the influence of science, in all of the books. And maybe, Alice, you might just talk about, art is a huge influence, as you said yourself in your introduction, but maybe you might just tell us a little bit more about, some of the artworks. And I know there's in your book as well, in Oona, there are real artists who are referenced in the books and are characters, related about in the book as well. So tell me how you kind of wove in those real details into your fiction story.
Let's see, how do I begin about that? I think I was trying to talk about how writing is a material practice, and the materials of art making, like the cover of the book is just some red pigment spilled actually onto my writing desk. So a lot of the actual writing itself was writing about pigments, about trying to get up really close to what it's like to move a paintbrush across a surface. Oona is a painter. I as well paint and did from a very early age. And so, yeah, I was trying to get up as close and tactile as possible to the materials of making art. And I don't know, trying to marry form and content to try to make how do I say it? How to make the sensuality of words and language the subject of what I was writing about. And in a couple of cases, there's a painting that's very central to the story of Oona, and so that's reproduced in the inside covers and the front and the back. It's a painting from Siena in the Quattrocento of San Bernardino rescuing a drowned child in a barrel. So there's a chapter about that. And there's also a chapter about the American painter Philip Guston, who was a very important influence on me when I was in art school. And Isaac Babel as well is kind of connected there to the Guston story. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I think how when you use those artworks, that art, and Oona herself is painting from a young age and is aware of art and the difference between her life as her fragmented kind of life, and art is the only thing that kind of makes sense of the life or begins to make it come together in any meaningful way. And that, as the novel progresses, you get a real sense that this is the real force in her life, and this is where Oona resides, really, not in urban farms in New Jersey, and a lot of the kind of the falseness of it or whatever, and it's only as she moving to Ireland that element of the novel is really interesting as well, where the novel changes. There's almost a change in register when it goes to Ireland, but art remains the focal point and the thing that brings the character of Oona together and brings herself back to herself. So yeah, it's really, really interesting from that point of view. And similarly, Marianne, in Ellen's story, because Ellen is obviously a real character, and you're saying you're writing a kind of a version of her life, as it were, and so it is fictionalized to an extent. So maybe you'll just talk a little bit about, there's a lot of science in it, there's a lot of botanical names, Latin names. So obviously you did a hell of a lot of research when you were writing the novel, but you've interweaved it really well, and you've brought the kind of human story of Ellen out very well in a story that is also loaded with a kind of a love for science and a love for knowledge, which is kind of contrary to what most women of the time would have experienced or would have been allowed to experience. But Ellen has managed somehow to carve out a place for herself. So maybe just talk a little bit about how you approach that dynamic.
I think one of the central themes of the book, and it's probably the one thing that made me want to write this novel, because I identified with it very strongly, which is this idea that art, but kind of beyond even art, it's, you know, the sensory experience, however that manifests itself, that is often what actually sustains us through our lives, when everything else can fall away or let us down or not live up to what we'd like it to be, or is outside of our control. And I always saw Ellen as somebody who had a certain fate sort of projected onto her by society, by her time, by her family, by the patriarchal system that she lived within, and somebody who was trying to find a way within that to actually survive. And, you know, she, you know, there's a hint in the book of her having mental health issues, and I did see her as somebody who was struggling with her mental health, but I saw that as a very natural, inevitable sort of result of somebody who was extraordinarily sensitive, intelligent, gifted, being squashed by this, you know, this world that she had to live in. And so I suppose that I knew nothing about science. I knew nothing about botany. I remember in school, I really struggled to remember Latin names, but the poetry of Latin and the poetry of those botanical names was something that really appealed to me. And as they're repeated through the book, they almost take on a sort of poetic language. And I actually approached the botany as if it was another language, like a foreign language, something that I had to sort of get to grapple with. I went back to the original botanical books that by Withering, that Ellen would have studied. And I absorbed some of the language from those books, which have a very definite flavour, that beautiful early 19th century language. So yeah, and Ellen is an artist as much as she is a botanist. I studied visual communications, as you said, in the National College of Art and Design. And before that, I was a painter, and I'm still a painter. So again, that is something I identified with very strongly. And I was very much able to enter Ellen's mind through the art. She has a wonderful eye. She was long-sighted, but she had excellent short-sighted, but she'd excellent. She could see things up close very, very well. And then the idea of microscopes and the idea of examining things up very close. Again, that was something that very much appealed to me. And actually, on the cover, you know, we brought in the botanical, the microscope as a symbol of this idea of examining a life. But yeah, it's the idea of the sensory experience, however we find it, sustaining us through our lives. That's a big theme in the book. All right.
Yeah, and it's true what you say, like despite her ill health and whatever, that she's still, throughout the book, she's determined to go abroad and collect these plants if she can at all, you know, which really comes across really in her favour in the book. And also, I think when you mentioned like the language of the Latin uses of the botanical terms, but also the language of the time as well, the Georgian kind of phrasing of very authentic, the way you've written the book, and in terms of the dialogue and the exchanges, where there's a lot that's unsaid or you know, left there, and the reader can you know pick out things that are either, particularly in the exchanges initially between Louise and Ellen at the start, a lot of undertone that's going on, you know, throughout that, where on the face of it everything is very polite and civilized, that there is a sense, and that civilization kind of falls away when she goes back to Cork, to Ballylickey, where her house is kind of, the brothers are going slightly deranged and whatever, and the things are, but it has that kind of almost a Gothic feel then as well, which is kind of very much of the time, is, you know, Georgian going into Victorian kind of novel narratives, which I think gives it this great novelistic sense. It makes it, you know, ring true as a novel of the time as well. So it has that kind of sense of there's a kind of dark clouds a lot of the time, you know, and you're getting a sense of something bad is going to happen, you know, which it builds up a great tension, I think, in the novel as well. So, and that's another kind of that's a visual language that's going on in the novel as well.
Yes, weather. People have commented to me on the importance of weather, and of course, when I was growing up, we were absolutely obsessed with weather, because both my parents were from a rural background to a certain extent, And so we would all sit around the 6 o'clock news. I'm sure we've all had the same experience. It was probably just an Irish thing of waiting for the weather forecast to come on, like it was some kind of religious,
Yeah, well, it is still the single biggest topic of conversation.
It is. The Irish people are absolutely obsessed with the weather because it's so changing, and that is a theme in the book. And Ellen talks about that. And of course, at that time where you had to make a decision on whether you went on a journey completely based on what the weather conditions were and what the roads were.
Like in the book, Bantry is almost inaccessible a lot of the time, and it's only down the road, or whatever. But for us today, it seems like nothing. But the
idea in the book as well, the distance between Cork and Dublin is another sort of this tension between the city.
It's a journey that, if you're of a certain age or you're not well, that you may not actually make it. That's
in your lifetime.
Yeah. I know it comes across very authentic in that way, Marianne. So it's really enjoyable that way. So Pat, I like science and art in the reason I like science and art in your stories as well is that I think I said at the start that a lot of your stories are, I suppose, what Hollywood would call high concept. I mean that in a positive way, because you've got some setups in the stories. Some of them are dystopian. Some of them are, you've got characters in peculiar situations, or you've got peculiar characters. I'm particularly taken with the middle story in the middle section, Chinese Sunglasses, which I think is a novelistic short story, really, and it's an excellent story of a young woman out of her kind of common area, finding herself almost isolated in China while her friend is at conference, and involves this strange technology as well that the Chinese have developed, these great sunglasses. But that's just one instance in the book. Maybe you talk about some of the ideas, or where your ideas come from, and are you really influenced by scientific developments, and art appears, of course, in other of your stories as well. The House of Future Art as well, particularly I'm thinking of. So maybe just talk a little bit about that.
Well, Marianne's and Alice's books, they affected me in different ways, because Marianne's book reminded me of I spent a couple of years in college studying botany as a minor, and it would be such a fantastic life if you could have made a living at it, but trying to remember those Linnaean classifications, you needed a brain that is not provided to me anyway. Basically, Alice is just, you just can't do everything in life. How lovely it would have been to do art as well, but you can't. You've got to choose. It's not available to you to do something like that. So I must say, it brought back to me a gap. Not having a background in visual art, which I love. I spend my Saturdays, browsing around. But in my stories, like art is about the emotion and drama, and science to a lot of extent is truth and actuality. But it's really important to try and bridge that, to me, because you can't make let's say if there's some concept that you think about, suppose it's cutting down trees or something, or some particular, or the development of a society like the Chinese society, it's impossible to address that in some way or boil it down without, you've got to have, there's a lot of art there. You've got to make yourself and the reader feel what the effect of this change, whatever change it is. And so art is the most important thing in the communication of the feeling. So when so writing short stories or any type of prose, is the art of conveying some type of perceived actuality to the reader. And like in my case, I do feel greatly, like for instance, in China, they've basically gone over the span of the 20th century from the type of civilization, although they were advanced technically, they were still in a civilization that we have here represented in Naut and Doubt, cycles of the sun and processions for let's say, the furthering of the harvest. They were having those in the early 20th century. And, you know, it's 2,000 years since we had those. And yet they have gone through in the span of the 20th century to, you know, to contending with Donald Trump about highway or what do you call it, TikTok or any of these things. I know I've been joking about those so long I can't even say the names properly, but it is to me important. I am trained as a scientist, and you know, you see a lot of these things that might greatly concern you, and you think, well, how can you possibly address these? And we probably, you know, you were going to talk about style. Like every single short story is some particular little idea you're going to address, and you know, you have a range of styles available to you, so you have to choose one that's appropriate to the drama or the feeling that you're trying to get across. You know, if it's the future being bad, then it's likely to be dystopian, as you say. But it may also be, you know, the mindset of what is the mindset of people likely to be as we get used to communicating through technology. It's definitely going to be, here we are communicating through technology. You know, things are definitely going to be different. And so, yeah, I guess, you know, that is basically that's the realm we find ourselves in. It is art, and it is technology, and it is science. And science is now probably the biggest thing in all of our lives, although we carry on as human beings, just being human beings. But for sure, I mean, climate change and loss of biodiversity are things I have to struggle to get away from every single day, you know?
Yeah. And I suppose, yeah, Pan, and I suppose, you know, we find ourselves in the middle of a pandemic that's going on, and like there's kind of less and less certainty about how the future might pan out, you know, as the summer has progressed. So I suppose, like, time has passed on for us here now this morning. Unfortunately, we're getting near the end. But I thought before we go, maybe you might just tell me how your artistic experience of living with pandemic has been, and has it been? I know you've got the books out, and you probably should be doing readings everywhere, and you should be doing launches, and you should be signing books in bookshops and traveling around the country and further afield, trying to get your name out there and get your book read. So a lot of that obviously can't happen. And so from a creative point of view, how are you guys doing? Have you been starting new projects or working on ongoing projects, Alice?
I haven't really started. I have a couple of things in the works, but no traction on a new novel. I am working, wanting to write another book, but I do think after you write something extended, you need a period of silence and just fallowness. And so I've just been allowing myself to have that while the pandemic rages. And also just, I think, at least for writers, we have books that go out into the world and that readers can find and buy. But I think so much about people who are more live artists, like music people, theater people, anyone who depends on a live audience. And I just think of how difficult that is, how difficult it is for them, how difficult it is for us as audiences of those kinds of events. I miss them. You know, I'm not worried about scientists. Scientists are, they have a purpose, a real purpose now and into the future. But in this kind of space, the purpose for creative people is a lot harder to find. And that space of connection that we have as audience people, as people going to restaurants and other public spaces where we can't connect, that's the thing that is really a challenge for me, and that I mourn. And of course also the people who haven't been able to really properly mourn those they've lost because of the virus, so all those things.
What about you, Marianne? Have you been
Well,
working on something new?
Yes, I mean, as I said, I'm still trying to establish a practice, as they call it, because it was very clear cut. With I just sat down and I want to write a book, and I sat down and I wrote a book, and I've worked in a creative profession for a very long time, so I'm used to establishing a good, healthy work practice and seeing things through. But as you said earlier, when you don't have deadlines imposed on you, then that it's deadlines that sustain that sort of work ethic. So you have to impose your own deadlines. I did work through the pandemic or through the summer on something. I've parked that now. I've started something new. I mean, I find that there's a lot of distraction. There's this low level of anxiety that is there all the time, and I don't think that's a healthy atmosphere for creativity, despite what people were saying during the lockdown. This is great, you can get all these paintings done and you can write that novel and you can learn Russian or whatever it was. I mean, that's very hard to do when you're aware that there's great suffering going on, and that there's, like Alice said, people's livelihoods are decimated. I mean, I'm upset this weekend for the restaurants. I'm just thinking of the people. I'm just thinking of those people trying to pick themselves up again and find the strength, because I've seen people, restaurants like locally, and I've seen the courage and the guts that it has taken to sort of say, oh God, how are we going to make this work now? We'll do takeaway, we'll get outdoor seating. And now they've had another punch, and now they have to rally again. And the thing is, we will rally, like I was saying earlier to you, we're a little bit down this weekend, we will rally again. But I mean, I do have those moments where I go, who cares about novels, and who's interested, and is that really what's important now? And that is what's important now, because I'm reading a lot. It's getting me through. We need art to distract us, and we need art to comfort us, and we need art to make sense of things. So I'll keep going. We'll keep going.
Yeah, this is what sustains us at these times.
I think.
Yeah. So Pat, you mentioned earlier, Pat, that you're working on longer form. Are you writing a novel now, or?
Well, I have been. I have a novel that is still being read by at least one publisher anyway. And for the first part of this, like, I guess a lot of it's a very changing environment. But for the first part of this, it was like being on a writer's retreat. Like my mum lives with us, and we were basically in isolation here. So I worked like absolute hell for several months, and almost to the end of another novel. But then all those things that we couldn't do kind of all swelled up like a wave, and normal life has crashed on us for the last month and a half or so. So not so much writing down just in the last little while, but it has been, I have to admit, it has been productive, because we just simply couldn't do anything else.
Yeah.
The garden actually looked like a reasonable garden,
Yeah, but I think you do need to find, you need to find something to do, and even whatever creatively you do, whether you think it's successful or not is another question. But I think the main thing is that you're doing it, I think, and producing work. I think it can be a job for a later day, maybe, to decide whether you've achieved what you want to achieve.
Well, yeah.
So, but there's always.
I think I've got to take whatever opportunity you get, and I mean, when you're not actually going out into the world, you don't see a lot of the other problems. It's only just lately that we've been able to go back into the market and places like that. True enough, there are lots of people that I've been giving tips in restaurants that you just wouldn't, because at least have been earning some money. There are lots of people who haven't been earning any money at all, and there is a big divide amongst those who have still been earning and those who haven't been earning anything at all. So that is a thing that you can't help feeling. But at the same time, it has been a time of reflection, and that's what you do when you're writing all the time. When you start reflecting, you can't help it. You start writing and go again. So
you're looking inward and you're creating, and that's important. Yeah. Thanks very much. Listen, I think we've run out of time, unfortunately, so I'm going to have to bring proceedings to a close. But I just want to thank the three of you for this morning's readings and for the discussion we've had. It's really enlightening. The three books I really, really enjoyed. I recommend the three of them to anybody who's listening in or watching. So thanks again, Alice, Marianne and Pat. The next event at the Bray Literary Festival will be a Dura Press 10th anniversary celebration and readings featuring Linda McKenna, Aoife Riley and John Walsh. So that'll be hosted by David Butler, and that's at 1 p.m. So once again, thanks very much for this morning, and I hope to see you again soon.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.